Oh, hey guys, thanks for checking out Next Level Carpentry, where you'll see how I made this live edge Deadwood puzzle box from a section of this very log. By the end of this lengthy video, I think you'll understand why I labeled it a rough cut production, but I think you'll enjoy the journey. So let's get started as I make a trip to a local outside the big box lumberyard to shop for and harvest this choice piece of unstarted furniture. My trip takes me over hill and dale, over underbrush and under overgrowth, across deadfalls, in and around all manner of snags and stumps, while searching for a perfect piece of dead wood. In case you don't know, not all dead wood is created equal. For this project, I'm looking for a medium diameter log without bark that's solid and dry as a bowling pin. About a mile in, and after a number of disappointing finds, I scored just the thing I'm looking for. It's an ash log that dried without bark, so it aged without rotting, so it's both solid and stable. Decades of decay gave the outside of the log an alligatored patina, leaving it with an interesting texture, ideal for the puzzle box project I have in mind. The sweet fragrance of sawing ash makes it one of my favorite woods to work with, so I savor the smell as I cut off a choice chunk destined to be an heirloom puzzle box. As I pack up and head back, I'll remind viewers that there's an extensive chapter list in this video's description to help you navigate through the many steps involved in turning this prime piece of unstarted furniture into the live edge Deadwood puzzle box you saw in the video's thumbnail. I never hurry to leave an unstarted furniture store, and this time is no different, so I let my mind wander as I hike, thinking about the stories this old tree could tell as a new chapter in its life begins. Here's that chunk of log you just saw me cut at the unstarted furniture store. It's a piece of ash from an old tree that had been laying there for I don't know how long in that canyon. And this is also the part where the uncut nature of the video starts to show up. I've got these three log sections. I believe this piece here, I cut some days earlier than this one. I don't know which end this came from. Came from there or from there, don't quite remember which. So I've got that cool piece. It's got this knot on here. And then I've got this smaller one, it's got a stub of a branch. But all these are excellent candidates for making a sliding lid box. But because of the uncertain nature, the irregular configuration of these pieces, and the inconsistent nature of the wood, I don't quite know how any of these boxes are going to come out. I've had failures before, start cutting into it, and some issue comes up, and I end up scrapping the box. So that's the uncut nature of the video. Whatever you saw in the video thumbnail is what I ended up with after making these, but that's a time in the future. Right now, this is what I'm starting with for these boxes. And if I spend a lot of time worrying about constructing the video so that everything comes sequentially and makes sense and is well choreographed, then I just wouldn't get it done. So here we go, and I can say at this point that this is really some of the kind of work I like most. It's just fun work, and it's not a production thing. There's no set boundaries on what the end product is going to end up like. So I'm going to get into this with and just kind of go through the basic steps that it takes to create one of the boxes you saw in the video thumbnail. And this box, or this log, I want to try something different with that later, kind of more of a in-depth thing. So I've got these two guys. This one's smaller, so it's kind of more manageable, but it's kind of got a hook in it, and there's some rod in the center, so I'm not sure what's going to happen there. So I think I'm going to use this fellow right here to make the basic standard box. So I'll show you a close-up of what this looks like as it came from the unstarted furniture store before I do anything to it here in the shop. But before I give you the close-up, I'll show you that I figured out that this is where this goes. You saw me cut it by hand. There's a little stub here that lines up with the stub there. So these two logs are brothers, and so that's kind of fun. I cut this one out of that log out there prior to cutting this piece, and I didn't shoot video or picture of this. I just wasn't doing it that day. So now we'll take a closer look. So here's this chunk in living color, and just for reference, this is about 6 inches in diameter, and I ended up with 11 inches long. That's a nice convenient length. It makes for a nice size box when it's all done. Like I said, this is ash, and that's nice because it's got a nice color when it's cleaned up. It's nice hardwood. The core of this is really dense on both ends. There's a split that doesn't matter. The bark was all off the log so that the wood didn't rot. And then it's been out there long enough to get this kind of alligatored texture, which I think is really cool. There's even some lichens in here. And then what attracted me to it are those features plus this kind of cool, gnarly looking, it's almost like a burl on top. And so those are the attributes of logs I look for. This log, that's a brother again. It's solid, similar diameter, etc. Similar aging, which makes it really nice. It's got this cool branch on it. And I cut this piece long because I couldn't really decide where I wanted to cut the box, you know, like this or like this, which piece I was going to use. And then now after I got it home, I'm thinking maybe I'll just make a really long box. So that's yet to be seen. This other small piece, this is from a different tree. Similar attributes to this log, although it's smaller in diameter. It has very interesting character, but it's got some actual rod in here. And that would be right where the hinge or the lid is cut. So if I cut into that, I'll have to deal with that stuff. But there's an infinite variety of species of wood. Walnut would be gorgeous. Box elder, if you could find a piece that was rotten but dense enough to make something out of. Oak, anything works. This is what's available to me. And I think you'll see the process that I'm going to show you can be adapted to species of wood. Really doesn't matter. It's the configuration of the wood initially, and then what you want to end up with for the overall look and function of the box. And I've made 2 of these so far, and these are the next 3. So I'm just going to show you what I've learned on those, but the whole process, everything about it is still kind of a work in progress. But the main thing I think you'll see in this video is how to make accurate machine cuts on something that's completely irregular like this. The only thing that's even close to normal is going to be the ends. And with that statement in mind, I'm going to true these up a little bit on the miter saw. These are just cut through with that little hand saw, and it's a little easier to work if the ends are a little more parallel and a little more flat. And it occurs to me as I go to make these cuts that I should add a caveat here. This is not dimensional lumber, and it just doesn't behave like a piece with straight edges and flat faces. There's potential for all sorts of mishaps using cutting wood like this with power tools. So just keep that in mind. If you're uncomfortable doing this stuff, just don't do it. It's not worth it. There's no box in the world that's worth a mishap. But I think with anyone that's got a reasonable amount of experience with their power tools, understands that the machines I'm using and general safety do's and don'ts, it's a perfectly repeatable process, but it's not, I'm not going out to buy a 6x6 or a 4x4 at the big box and making something out of it. So there's that irregular nature to the whole process. So keep that in mind. Make sure you're careful and safe. Here's what this looks like at the miter saw, and as you'd expect, I have a cutting depth capacity issue with this size of a log and this size of a miter box. But in general, I'm getting the ends square and somewhat parallel to each other, and that just helps if I want to clamp this thing in the vise later on. As long as I'm at it, I'm going to trim the ends on the smaller log so you can see what it looks like for comparison. And because of the smaller diameter, I'm able to make these cuts all the way through. And I kind of orient the log as I envision it turning out for the box in the end as I make each of the cuts, rather than making both of the cuts to the left side of the blade. And finishing up the first cut on this little log is a bit of a dicey operation, and I'm comfortable making it with a miter saw, but if there's any unease, it's a simple process to finish that cut with a handsaw instead. And you can see with that initial trimming done that these logs, they kind of stand there, they're kind of stable, unlike this one that's still sort of irregular, but I'm not trimming this now because I might do something a little different with that, like I've been saying. So that's kind of the first step in my mind, kind of picturing the way the log is going to end up oriented in the finished box, and then cutting those ends reasonably true to each other, etc., etc. That kind of makes a more manageable piece. So with that out of the way, step number 2 is another one of those steps where it's a little bit unusual to handle and manipulate the piece because of its irregular nature, but it's totally doable. So what I'm doing next is I'm going to create the flat bottom of the box. Here I'm going to visualize the position of the box and shave the bottom of the log off on the joiner. Before flattening the bottom of the box, I ran the dust collector for a few minutes to pull all the shavings and chips out of the joiner and the table saw, because I've let that build up in the machines doing smaller projects the last week or so, and I wanted to get them cleaned out before doing this, so that I can use both machines without noise from rushing air of the dust collector complicating the video production process. And that works nice because it doesn't make a huge amount of shavings doing this, and I don't want to have everything running while I'm doing it. So here I am at the joiner. For anybody that doesn't know, this is an 8-inch Powermatic. I've got a helical cutting head on here, and so it makes a nice smooth cut. But I want to mention that it's a precision machine, and this is an old log from from outside. So I'm cautious. I want to make sure there's no dirt in here. There's probably going to be a little bit of dirt and grit, and this can be kind of hard on the knives, but that's what I'm doing. I'm making a box. If it wrecks the knives, I'll replace them. So that's that. A person could clean this off with a wire brush, do all sorts of things if you're worried about dirt in there, or if the log you had was particularly dirty, you could power wash it for one thing. You might be able to shave this off with a chainsaw or something else to get it started to avoid damaging the knives. But in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and do this. So I'll bring you in close and talk about the process. I see the joiner is ideally suited to this process. This could be done with by securing the log and using a bandsaw to shave the bottom. Some people might be more comfortable with that. But this is kind of a one and done deal, which is why I like it. So what I need to do is orient the log so that this feature ends up where I want it in the finished box. And I don't know if you can see this, but the log's got a taper, and I want the top of the box to be kind of level, so I'm going to have to raise it up and attempt to plane this with that log orientation. I'm actually going to spin it around this way because I want about an 1/8 inch, 3/16 of an inch tilt to the log. You can see it pivoting here, I think. So I'm guesstimating that to be 3/16 of an inch. So I'm going to set the joiner to that by lowering the infeed table, and I'm guessing 3/16 of an inch. So now this table is 3/16 of an inch lower than that one. So if I put the log like this is how I want it. You can see how I slide it, and that end is sitting on the outfeed table. So that's how I'm going to start this cut. I'm going to start with 3/16 to nothing, shaving off the bottom and trying to keep this somewhat oriented the way I want it. And this is, this is the part with potential danger. If you got a log here and it flipped, you got a problem. If your hands slip, if things rotate, there's all kinds of potential issues. But this isn't a very heavy pass, actually, and I'm comfortable with my hands up here. If anything goes wrong with the log, my hands are going to be up here, and it'll just trash the log, which I don't really care about. It's expendable. So I'm also aware that when the cutter head starts rotating, if it's in the log, it's going to want to kick the log back, so that's a potential thing. So I'm just going to do this, run this first pass here, and show you what it looks like. And while I'm throwing many safety principles out the window, I am not throwing the guard out, and I'm waiting until the machine comes to 100% stop before I do anything. But here you can see what a 3/16 inch pass looks like on the bottom of the log. It's very little at this point because I'm just cutting off bumps and a bit of the outside radius of the log. But now when I hold the log, it's pretty good shape. This top is fairly parallel. I could measure actually. So I'm looking at 5 3/4 on that. 5 3/4, 5 7/8 there. So that first pass was good. Looking at the log from the end, I'm dealing with the rotation of this, and I want this thing to end up mostly on the top. So I think the next pass I'm going to tilt it just slightly this way and take another pass. But I'm going to drop this down or raise it up so that the cut is more like 1/8 of an inch. And now when I hold the log, I'm balancing it on that flat spot. So it's kind of indexing already, which is a nice thing. All the potential dangers from the first pass still remain, so I'm conscious of what's going on with the machine in my hands and the workpiece as I make this cut. And this is exactly the kind of progress I'm after. Now I've got a nice flat plane here. This piece doesn't rock anymore. And I just kind of reassess the position of the log. Now I'm kind of down to 5 1/2, which is pretty good. I like how this knot is centered up here, like this. So this is a good thing. So now what I'm paying attention to is how big I want the bottom, how much of this I want to take off. And this is the artistic part. I don't want the bottom of the box to be rounded. I want the box to have 2 curved sides. So I'm going to end up taking off quite a bit of this. More like that. That's about 1/2, 3/4, that's probably 3/4 of an inch. Because I want the bottom of the box to start somewhere in here, more or less. So I'm just going to run a bunch of passes on here to trim the bottom of that box off. And as I'm doing this, I think you can see that this part is more art than science. The science is being careful with the machine, making cuts, but the art is determining, looking ahead to what the resulting box is going to look like and adjusting accordingly. If there's any issues with the top of the box being parallel, or if you want it sloped for some reason, if the features you're wanting to display on top of the box need to be presented differently, you could rotate the log at this point, because each successive pass gets you closer to the end result, but also gives you flexibility to work with the irregularities of the log as you establish the final orientation and design and look of the box at this stage. And I decided to run a 1/2 inch pass on there just so you could see what that looks like. I wouldn't want to do that on the first pass because there's too much instability, but at this stage I've got a nice flat surface to register to, and look at that, I'm just hogging off a full 1/2 inch in one beautiful pass. Thought you might get a kick out of that. I'm just careful to start this up and make sure that the cutter head isn't engaging the workpiece when the cutter head starts spinning as I finish up this pass. And that's just pretty cool to see if you ask me, but now I've established a working bottom of the box, and in hindsight it might have made more sense to flatten this first and trim the ends after. But regardless, it's going to vary from a project to project, but this is a good place to be for this project at this stage. The next step is to determine how deep the box will be and what the lid's going to look like and fit like. And I'm going to guess about 3 inches for the depth of the box here, just has a theory. If the box is 3 inches deep, I have to cut the channels for the sliding lid in there. And that takes a 1/2 inch of material, so the depth of the box is 2.5 inches, less like 3/8 of an inch for the bottom. So that'd be about 2 1/8 inches deep for the box. Then the lid can be cut like this. You'll see how this works later. But those two have to interlock. And this is kind of a tall profile for the lid. So I'm going to raise this up. I'm going to go 3. Let's go 3 1/4. 3 3/8. Let's see what 3 3/8 does to the world here. This would be 3 3/8. This joinery would switch. The box would still look like this. You can tell by my hesitation here that I'm a little bit apprehensive, because if there's any point in the project where you can screw it up and just totally ruin the log, it's at this point. Because this is kind of an all or nothing, the next step is kind of an all or nothing step. So I'm going to erase this, and I'll just put it on the other end and see what it looks like. Let's go with that 3 3/8 and see if it makes sense. This 3 3/8, just going to kind of scribe that across here. I could do a better job of that if I had to. But that'll get notched down for the slot. The lid would be like this. So I think that that's okay. I'm going to go for it. I'm going to cut this at 3 3/8. Actually, I think I'm going to go 3 1/4. Something in my gut is telling me that would be a good idea. And the factors that are in play is that the log isn't a perfect cylinder, so it can look good on this end, but if the log changes shape as it goes from one end to the other, the profile that ends up getting cut might run out, and then the lid won't be functional or the box won't be functional. But at some point you got to kind of commit and go for it, otherwise you never publish. So final answer, 3 1/4 for the height of the box. To separate the lid from the box, I'm using a rip blade. This is a full 1/8 inch kerf, you'll see why in a minute, and it's a flat top grind just for keeping the cut clean. But one thing I'm not doing is using a blade stabilizer, because ultimately I'm going to end up with a pretty serious depth of cut here, and the blade stabilizer would get in the way. But this way I can ultimately cut most of the way through this log with this projection. But I've got the fence set to 3 1/4, and I'll lower the blade down and take this in a number of passes just to keep it under control. And this is a teachable moment for safety. This operation certainly makes a lot of sense to do on a bandsaw. You can make the cut all at once, etc., etc. Not everybody has a bandsaw, and I want to demonstrate that for a log this size, a box this size, it can be done on a table saw. I've got Smurf gloves on so I can keep a firm grip on the piece. People panic when they see table saw blades and Smurf gloves. That's fine. If it makes you uncomfortable, don't do it. I do it so I have a firm grip on the piece, and I know my hands aren't going to be near the blade where it gets sucked in, which is the danger of gloves and a spinning blade. That's that. Like I said, I'm going to do separate passes so that the depth of cut is less and the amount of force required is minimal. If this were a little bit different, I could put an auxiliary fence on here to keep this from rotating. But for this cut, I want to put an auxiliary fence on there. I don't like how that can tilt. But if there's ever a time for a riving knife, for a saw stop, it's here and now for this. Those are wonderful things. I don't have them on this saw, but those are definitely sensible things to have and to deploy at a time like this. But I'm going to get this auxiliary fence set up. And of course, auxiliary fence is just a fancy name for a piece of S-crap screwed on the fence so that it's 90 degrees to the table. And because I've got thickness added to the fence, I need to disregard the vernier on the table saw and set my 3 1/4 inch measurement to the blade itself. Like so. Suitable blade height. Glasses. Smurf gloves. Workpiece. Earplugs. Fire in the hole. And it's not even a bad thing that that doesn't cut all the way through. Other boxes I've made, the log was kind of parallel or tapered instead of pretty parallel like this. So at one end it wasn't cut all the way through, and sometimes on the other end it is. Even if I have the capacity to cut all the way through, like on this smaller log, often I'll leave the blade a little shy. So there's a web of wood that holds the lid on. But with proper hand positioning, etc., if the blade cuts all the way through, the lid just falls off to the side. But with that step, you can see now that I've committed to this setting to cut the lid off the box. And I hope I'm not wrong. And this is the stage where it's nice to have clean ends on the log so that I can clamp it in the bench habit here, maybe if the log's not too long. Yep, we're golden, and look at how nice and parallel that is. So the log's clamped firmly, and I can set about cutting this with a handsaw the rest of the way through. And I'm going to try to cut flush to the top of this saw kerf. And this is where the bandsaw guys are way ahead of the game. But that's what it takes to separate the lid from the body of the box. Easy peasy. And while I'm at it, I'll just put an orientation mark here on the end so that I kind of don't forget which end is which in the event that would happen. The way this box is working out, I am going to just use a hand plane to clean up that little bit of wood sprue on there. Because if I take it right to the joiner, that piece is going to be hard to index. It's a tough little knot in there. Take a little less of a bite. There he goes. This particular piece of wood has a fair amount of irregular grain because of the knot, etc. Makes it a little tricky to deal with that way. But once I've got it flattened out for the most part, I'll take it to the joiner where I switch from a maximum pass to a minimum pass and clean up the bottom of the lid in one swipe. I see this as pretty routine progression from log to box for this stage of the game. How the pieces come together. This looks kind of sweet sitting on top like that. And I suppose if a person was determined, you could figure out a hinging system or some type of attachment and just have the log like this with a box in there. But my goal is to make the sliding lid that you saw. So the next step in accomplishing that is to flatten the top of this. The bottom of the box, which I will write on here, is all flat, true, and no twist. The top has a bump in it because of the table saw process. So I'll just put some squiggle marks on here and use the thickness planer to true that up. And you can see that I set the planer to 3 1/4 inches, switch the planer to the slow feed rate, and ease the piece into the machine where it barely takes anything on the first pass. So I lower the cutter head a 32nd of an inch and feed the piece in. Notice that I skew the piece as it goes in so that the cutter engages just the corner of the bottom instead of the whole width of the end. And by skewing the piece, it minimizes the effect that the feed rollers have on tipping the piece up as it enters the machine, and I get a smoother, cleaner cut without snipe. A couple light passes clean up the top of the block, and for good measure, I flip it over for one pass on the bottom of the block to remove the marks from the helical cutter head on the joiner and put that glass smooth finish on the bottom of the block at the same time as well. The next step in the process is to make a viable lid for the box, and that's just kind of a logical decision because if I make the box first and then try to fit the lid to the box, then I realize that the lid can't be, it's too small or something, it won't fit the opening in the box, then I've got to scrap it and start over. So I'm going to set about making this into a viable sliding lid for that. And I'll take it over to the bench habit to lay it out. Basically what I'm saying here is that I can make the box fit any lid, but I can't make the lid fit any box. So to lay this out, I've just got the orientation marks here. For reference, just going to flip this over. And you'll notice that this lid is fairly rectangular. Depending on the shape of the log, you might end up with a piece for the lid that's, you know, tapered or less uniform than this. But for the lid to slide in the box, the sides have to be parallel. So I'm kind of lucky in this situation that this will be a little easier to do. But what I'm going to do is just kind of generally mark the center. So if that's, call that 3 inches there, this is 5 1/2, 2 3/4. And that's pretty good. This is almost 6 here, so that's 3. These are just relative center marks. 5 3/4, 2 7/8. So those marks are centered up at different points, and I'll just try to average them out and connect it. And I'm thankful here that this is so easy because it makes for easier video production. So I'm going to call that the center line of the lid, which is all well and good. Now I'll gingerly clamp this box lid like this. I want to square up that center mark using one of my little Guru Machine Works squares. I love this little guy from my buddy Greg at Greg's Garage. Here we are marking centers for that. I'll just gingerly clamp this in here like so. So the center's established, and I know the tongues on the sliding lid are going to be a 1/4 inch thick, so let me set that up on this little double square by Starrett. It's an amazing little tool. Squeeze right in there to 1/4 inch. I'm just going to put a mark here like so. It's hard to do with the camera sitting right there. And I need to have at least 1/4 inch ears on this thing so I can make the lid that wide on this end of the block. So let's see what that lays out. That's let's call it 2 3/8, which would be 4 3/4. So technically I could max this out at 4 3/4. So tricky to mark. 2 3/8 doubled 4 3/4. So I could make the lid this wide according to this end of the block like so. So that's the maximum for this end of the block, or lid. Just going to flip this around. And kind of be careful because I don't want to smash any of these cool features on here in the process, which is yet another challenge of making these boxes. Get all that amazing patina on there and it could spoil it with one careless move. This time I'll go over here and mark this so I don't look like such a klutz. And the maximum on the other end was 2 3/8. And you can see on this end, this could be 2 5/8. This could be 5 1/4 on this end, but that doesn't work on the other end. So we're just going to go with the 2 3/8 from the other end. And that'll be the maximum width for this lid because of its shape. So now I can just reposition the lid in the bench habit and put good marks at 2 3/8 over here, 4 3/4 over here, 2 3/8. Looks like that 4 3/4 is just a little bit off there, so adjust that. And the next step, this will just kind of all straighten itself out, you'll see, but I want to make the lid as wide and as big as I can because that makes the opening in the box bigger ultimately. And I'm just drawing these lines on here for reference, even though you'll see momentarily that they're not both necessary. Hard to do with the camera running like that. All right, so this is an LVL right now, an LVL, which is the largest viable lid. Well, there's easily a good handful of ways of trimming this lid to size, and I'm not going to bother listing them here. I'm just going to put my Smurf gloves on and do it lazy man's way on the joiner. I'll move the fence over this way to keep things a little more sensible. Then I'll just take successive passes and sneak up on one of these marks. Yeah, let's go with that one. And it doesn't take long to get that shaved off. And actually, as soon as I get the edge so that it's parallel to one of those lines, I can quit. This one I just planed it right up to the line. But I'll take care of the other side on the table saw. And this just keeps getting easier, but I don't want to let that lull me into a sense of complacency, because after all, I'm still working with power tools fully capable of amputating body parts. And so I'm set up, Smurf gloves. I'm going to drop this blade way down. The cut's not that demanding, so I am not putting a blade stabilizer on there, but I do want to make the cut at 4 3/4, and I'm going to go just a little bit strong so I can run it over the joiner for a final pass. But basically, I've got the center line that was centered up in the piece. This edge is parallel to that center line, so now I'll just rip the other side off and have a perfectly parallel lid. And the blade just needs to be high enough to cut through this piece. I'm good with this. Got a little margin there for joining. So I'll take a nice, slow, easy pass at a 1/16 of an inch and clean up the other side of this lid. And now you can see how this thing is starting to shape up. There's the piece we just cut off. Came from there. Everything is set up and orientationalized, whatever that means. And now I want to locate the lid onto the log bottom blank. And I got all these orientation marks in the way here, so let's get rid of those. And one of those oops erasers is irreplaceable for that. But I eliminated the center mark in the process, so let's redo that. Get a nice bold center mark, because that is really important at this stage. Like that, and then it's also important that I redo the orientation marks over here, because it's harder and harder to tell one end from the other, and I don't want to get it mixed up. So we will just put a circle over here. This should be out of the way. Actually, I'm going to make it bigger because that'll matter in a little bit. So now the point is to center the lid on the bottom. I'm just kind of eyeballing everything here like that. See, because I can shift it back and forth one way or the other. I want to keep the ends lined up the best I can. There's some weak wood over here. That'll still be okay. Once I eyeball this whole thing, I'm going to go with that and transfer the center mark from the lid to the base. Nice and sharp, clearly visible. Do that on both ends with nothing moving. And now those center marks are going to line up forever and always as I go through these next steps. Like that. And just for future reference, I'll draw the sides of the box on the top, or I'll draw the sides of the lid on the top of the box. Like that. And I'm going to put an O here. Let's put an O over here and an O over here. Just kind of help visualize everything. So now those two pieces are all registered with each other. It's just a matter of making a lid, or finishing the lid, and then making the box, cutting the box to fit that lid. I've mentioned the concept of sequence before in other videos on other projects, and this is another case where that's so important, because if I was to try to attempt any of these steps out of sequence, then I'm not working with given attributes, I guess I'll say. So, you know, the ends of this box aren't perfectly true to each other because everything's irregular, but the top and the bottom are parallel. That's very important. I've got center marks now, even though the ends aren't true. And the lid, for all intents and purposes, this is like S3S lumber, surface 3 sides, 2 edges and a face. And so this face is kind of irrelevant anymore. But it got that way from the very beginning when I flattened the bottom of the log. Broke off a piece of beautiful wood. I'll have to get that stuck back on there. No problem, you'll see why. But I want to put a piece of masking tape on that so I do not lose it. I cannot replace that little piece. There's only one of those in all creation, and it's right there. Where was I? So I established the shape and the orientation of this lid in the very first step. If now I decided the lid was too thick on one end and I wanted to change that, it just starts to throw other things off. I think it would lessen the visual appeal of the final piece because it would be kind of artificially generated. If I'm using decent terms there. But anyways, because of the sequence to this point, some of these steps are just really pretty simple to do. And the next step that I need to do is to cut little ears on this for the part of the sliding lid. But because I've got a perfectly flat surface and two perfectly parallel edges, that's pretty easy to do. And for clarity purposes, I'll do this back at the bench habit. This is still set for 1/4 inch, so I need little ears that are 1/4 inch thick. And then I want them to stick out 1/4 inch, so that'll be this amount. This material gets removed, as does this material over here. And because everything that matters is true and parallel, I can remove that nice and clean by registering from that. So I will put a reference mark at 1/4 inch on this edge, right there, and use that to set the blade height over here. I think that'll do. So my blade height is set nicely there. And this is more of that rough cut video thing in the works, because I hope that camera comes out right. I didn't set up a special light for that, but I'm sure you get the idea. Earlier I mentioned that I was using a flat top grind blade in the saw, and this is why. Because I'm just going to remove that little extra material with successive passes, just like a little teeny dado blade. If I was doing a whole batch of these, I could set up a dado blade, set it to 1/4 inch, and take this all out in one piece, one pass. But I'm just doing one lid right now, so I'm just going to take it away 1/8 inch at a time. which is why I'm using a full kerf blade. If I had a thin kerf blade, it just means extra passes. But to make that little ear, I can now just set the fence to 1/4 of an inch because the blade is set to a 1/4 inch height and locked in. So I'm just going to set a 1/4 inch here, and I'm going to set it just a little bit strong. Am I? Yeah, I'll set it right at a 1/4. I'm going to set it just a little bit strong. I'm going back to that final answer. That way I can shave a little bit off to get a nice fit on the lid later. If I cut too much now, the only width slot I can make is a 1/4 inch. I can't make the slot any less than a 1/4 inch. So this will help. And I'm just kind of mumbling to myself. But now this is just a matter of removing that little bit of material with this setup. And if this will focus for you, you can see what I'm doing here. There's the first little 1/8 inch dado to take that out. Now I'll just move the fence over and take successive cuts until that's all gone. Hope you can see that. Move the fence, make a pass on each edge of the lid. Move the fence, make a pass on each edge of the lid. Lather, rinse, repeat until it's done. Well, the reason this looks like this at this stage is because I guess I lied to you. I thought I had my full 1/8 inch kerf blade in there. It's in the drawer. That is the thin kerf blade. So when I move the fence 1/8 of an inch, it leaves that little 64th or 32nd of an inch flange in between there. But the bottom line is I just make enough cuts until that all that material is removed like that, all cut through. Then I have a nice uniform width of the lid up at, in this section, whatever you want to say. But that little oversight is a no-brainer to take care of. Just clamp this in the bench habit. I'll do it this way so you can see it, even though it's harder to do. And then I just use a sharpened putty knife to scrape those little flares or flanges of wood off there. I get a perfectly smooth shoulder on the side of the lid, just like that. And this is where a flat top grind blade is important, because I want that shoulder to be flat. I don't want little ridges in there from a blade like a triple chip grind blade or an ATB blade, which would leave ridges in there and require more scraping to clean up. As it is, that's perfect. And now you can see where that step has taken us. Have a very viable lid and a box. And the next step is going to be to make the lid fit into the box. But like I said in the beginning, this kind of work is just fun. I don't know, maybe it doesn't do that for everybody, but to see something like this, just organic, irregular, and transform it into something like this, that's going to be a useful piece, is fun. Another thing that you can't tell on the camera is that one of the joys of being in the shop with this is that ash is one of my favorite woods. The aroma that comes off of this when I'm running it through the tools, I just love it. It's right in there with walnut and cherry and some of those. So that just adds to the experience and the pleasure of doing a project like this. And I think it's even more fun as the process continues. I'm going to do a little sidebar here and replace that chip before it gets lost or I forget to do it. And I'll clamp the piece back in the bench habit to perform this little miracle of replacing this perfect little chip in that perfect little spot. Anyone that's familiar with the channel will not be surprised a bit by the process, but I'm breaking out my Starbond CA glue assortment, where the first step is to check the fit of the piece, which we've done. Know that that goes just right like that in there. Nothing complicated about it. In this case, I'm putting an accelerator on the piece, on the chip, not on the log. Just stick it to this piece of tape. give it a little spritz of the aerosol accelerator. That's hunky-dory. Grab the plastic mallet there. And now I'm going to apply clear medium CA into this little area here. Because the glue will end up shiny and the wood is dull, I'm going to be careful not to let too much of it squeeze out. There's remedies for it, but if I don't have to deal with it, it's a little simpler. I've got plenty of time. The accelerator is flashed off on this piece. It doesn't matter. I'm not in a hurry to do anything with it. That glue is just kind of flowing out and settling in, and I don't really have a time concern with that. But once I put this piece in there, I gotta move. So let's just do that right now. I got about 3 seconds to perform that move, and I'm just gonna give that a little tap so that the grain here kind of re-engages with what it broke out of. And this is all real time, and that chip is there forever, for always, and for good, and you can not tell that it chipped off of there, thanks to Starbond glue. Come to think of it, I probably should have had Chip come in and repair that chip, right? He's taking the day off. But I haven't given a whole lot of thought to what I'm going to say here, but one of the, like the overriding principle or whatever that I'm employing here is to take an irregular shape and create reliable registration faces on it. I guess that's some way of saying it. Started that by making a flat surface on the bottom, then creating a parallel flat surface on the top, starting with a flat surface here, creating a straight edge, putting a parallel edge on it. And so that's probably the biggest difference in working with organic materials, irregular materials versus dimensional lumber or sheet goods. Those already have those reference surfaces on them. Working with logs, natural materials, usually you end up having to create that surface and then working from it. And that makes the gears run in my head to figure out the quickest way to do that, the best way to do that, while preserving the natural configuration of the piece. You know, I can't just cut this knot off and then put it back on or whatever. So I have to leave those and work around it to create a piece like this. So the block has parallel faces, the lid has a flat face and parallel edges, but I need to transfer the shape of the lid into this block, and all we have now to work with is these parallel lines. So I'm going to put this back in the vise and transfer the layout so that you can see and I can see what needs to be cut out of this block to make the lid fit. So here's the block clamped in the vise. This is the end. It'll go here, but I'm just going to transfer this end onto the block. And this step's a little awkward to explain and to visualize as I'm doing it, but in reality it's really simple. This block is going to, or the lid is going to recess down into the block here, but I don't want this curve to dive down below this surface level. And maybe this will help if I take a piece of 1/4 inch material and just draw a line here. Okay, so there's a 1/4 inch reference line, and you can see there's just a little bit of this natural edge above that 1/4 inch line. So when I lay out for the lid on the end of the box, if I go more than 1/4 of an inch, this wood is going to dive below it, this surface. But I'm safe at 1/4 inch here. And I'm safe at 1/4 inch on the other side of the lid. So I'm going to use that as a setting for the depth of the little T-slots that are going to make this lid work. And so I've got my little double square here, and I can lay out 1/4 inch on each side. That represents the depth of the top of the notch. So there'll be a little shoulder right here. Oops, wait, I almost did that backwards. That is truly the depth or the thickness of the top of the little T-slots. like that. But this is the side of the flange down here. Kind of scared myself for a minute there. Thought I made the lid too wide. Okay, so those two marks are the width of that lid. So I'll reset this to a 1/2 inch. And most of this layout's just so you can visualize what we're about to do. So this will be the bottom of the lid here at a 1/2 inch down. Like that. And then the shoulders of the cuts are going to be up here. Like this. This is tricky to do in the camera. That. And the same thing on the other side. So I can erase this line here. Get rid of this so it's not confusing. And then this material needs to come out for the lid to slide in there. T-shaped profile, T-shaped notch. And I hope that makes sense. While I'm at it, I'm going to square these marks down because these are the actual cut marks here. This line and this line are what I start with, because that's the width of the shoulders of this lid that have to fit in between there. And this is the stage I was anticipating in my head the best I could when I was deciding how thick to cut this. And I thought about going 3.5, and I better go 3 1/4. So that made this less and this more. Had I gone 3 1/2, this lid probably wouldn't have worked because it would have been a 1/4 inch less thickness. As it is, these two shoulders they're just a 1/4 inch thick. That T-slot that holds the lid is just a 1/4 inch thick, and that's a little bit light. Right now, if I could rewind the clock, go back in time, I would have cut this at 3 1/8 instead, or maybe even 3 inches. But this is the point in the project where you kind of make it or break it. On the first box I made, I had some problems with it. The lid wasn't parallel, some other things. It just, the whole thing didn't work. And this is also why I chose this log for this part of the video, because I think you can imagine by now with this perspective how it's trickier to plan out a log like this. It's got a curve to it, it's narrower, there's all these things going on, and this is kind of the stage in my mind where the project, you make it or break it. I would prefer if those little T-slot ears were more like 5/16 of an inch, but because the way I cut the lid, if I drop it down another 1/16 of an inch, then this fits funny in the top of the box later. I don't like that fit. It might even have been better to go with 3 inches for that, make this lid thicker, so this little shoulder would be taller, so the slot for these ears would be farther down, and make those little lugs thicker. So this will probably just be confusing unless you're actually doing one of these boxes. Once you've kind of gone through the gears, this will make a lot of sense, because it's making a lot more sense to me. And this is my third attempt at one of these boxes. So with all that said, I hope that perspective helps you plan out and anticipate so that you don't have many failed experiments. You can have success with a box sooner rather than later. So with all that said, now I'm back to the thing about sequence and putting reliable, true reference surfaces on an irregularly shaped object. And so to make this, to notch this out, the first step is going to be to basically plow this out with a wide, just by dadoing that out. And I can just do that on the saw, but I can't register the sides of the log against the fence because they're irregular. These lines need to be very accurate and very parallel. And the process I use, or the method I use to accomplish this, has evolved a little bit to where it's like, wow, I wish I would have thought that in the first place. But that's what I'm going to do now. Set this up so I have parallel reference edges for cutting that middle out. And I shall use a humble piece of 1/4 inch melamine faced MDF to accomplish the purpose. For this piece of melamine coated MDF to serve its purpose, it needs to have a few attributes. And the first attribute is that it needs to be wider than the log at any point, which this piece is. And the second attribute it needs is to have a center line. This piece measures 7 1/4, and that measurement isn't really all that critical as long as it's wider than the log itself. And I will draw a center line at 3 5/8. Feel free to convert that to metric as required. And my setting's a little bit off, so I have 2 lines, but in between those is the perfect center of that piece. The log already has center lines on it, but I need to extend the center lines to the bottom of the block, which will be that. I didn't mention it, but the other attribute this piece needs is that it needs to be longer than the block. And what this simple piece of melamine coated MDF allows is a transfer of straight edges from the center line of this irregular block to the center line of this piece. So I want to make sure that that center line lines up on both ends. Now, to keep the block oriented on that center line and firmly attached to the melamine, I just flip the block over and use this spec tape, double-sided tape. This roll was a gift to me from a patron and subscriber by the name of Skip. So thanks, Skip. This stuff is great, and I'm using it here. It's just a really nice tape. It's got good properties and performs well. There'll be a link to this tape. You can get it from Amazon. That'll be in the video description for anybody that isn't aware of this stuff or hasn't tried it yet. It's not necessarily inexpensive, but it is a great product that performs extremely well, as you're about to see. Once I've got the tape stuck to the log and managed to peel off the backer, I just flip the log over, carefully lining up the center marks, and then kind of pounding on the MDF with the ball of my fist to stick it to the bottom of the ash log block. I'm also centering the block of wood up end for end on the MDF. So that's now firmly stuck, and the center line is lined up on either end. So that now I can transfer lines from the top of the T-slot down onto the piece of MDF so that I can use those lines to guide the cuts for the T-slot. And if I've done everything correctly and paid careful attention to accuracy and layout, both these lines will be the same distance in from the sides of the melamine piece, which in this case is 1 inch and 17/32. I want the cut to be on this line, which is a 1/4 inch ear and a 1/4 inch space, or a 1/2 inch down from the top of the block. So I'll use this mark right here to set the height of the blade on the table saw, which should end up at a 1/2 inch. Because this cut is wider and shallower, I am going to switch to that full 1/8 inch curved rip blade, and I can add the blade stabilizer for a cleaner, smoother cut while I'm at it. Lighting here is going to make it hard to see, but all I'm doing in this step is setting the blade height to the pencil mark on the end of the block at a 1/2 inch. I lock the blade height in place and then slide the fence over so that the cut lines up with the pencil mark on the MDF. And because this cut is critical, I'm going to go a little wide of the mark so that I can sneak up on the exact width of the final cut later. As it is, everything is all set up and good to go. So I just flip the log over and let the MDF glide along the rip fence to guide straight cuts perfectly parallel to the center line and centered up accurately in the irregular width of the log. And that setup makes this process perfectly safe and very accurate. You can see where the cuts are in relation to the pencil marks. And you can also see that I can trim off a little more on either side to get a good fit of the lid in the box. So I'm going to do that right now to establish the overall width of the slot before I end up cleaning the rest of this out. I move the fence just ever so slightly closer to the blade and run another couple passes to sneak up on those pencil marks. And a couple extra passes, dial that in to the exact width I need for a nice fit on the lid in the log, so that now I can move the fence the opposite direction and make sequential passes at 1/8 inch each until the passes line up in the center of the log, and I've completed the steps for making the slot for the lid to slide in the log. Here again, if I was doing more of these, or if efficiency mattered, I could switch to a dado blade and make this wide slot in 2 or 3 passes instead of dozens. But this is plenty quick for a one-off project like this log box. And that's all there is to it for clearing out the bulk of the material for the T-slot for that lid. Now by clamping the block down and making a few passes with a sharpened putty knife, I can clean up this shallow, wide dado in nothing flat. And I think you'll agree that that's a more than acceptable result for the speed and accuracy of the process. And you can see here how the lid fits nicely between the sides of this shallow, wide dado, and that the next step is to route grooves in each side of the dado to accept the ears on the sliding lid in the top of the box. Now that I'm done dadoing this lid recess into the log, this guide block has served its purpose, and I can just release this by prying this off and separating the spec tape and MDF from the log. And you can see how nicely that works. So thanks again to Skip for turning me on to that spec tape. It works great for that. Previously I would have used small brads to nail that on there, which I know it holds positively, but then I end up with little nail holes. So this is a better system. And now that that's done and gone, we know the next step is to make notches, and based on the geometry there, that notch needs to be 1/4 inch deep and 1/4 inch tall, so the lid fits in there. And it's a bit of a trick to get that done. So I'm going to take this over to the bench and show you how I go about accomplishing that. Here's the end of the log with the layout in it, and there's the 1/4 by 1/4 notch that needs to happen so the lid slides in there. And it's no surprise I can use a router bit to make that. And this is a white side router bit that I bought specifically for this purpose. It's a 1/4 inch slot cutter, but the way it's set up from the factory, just got a teeny bearing on here, so the depth of the slot is a full 1/2 inch, and I didn't want to leave this extra wide to cut the slot and then trim that off. So what I did to accomplish this is I just take this little stop collar off here, slide that off, and then I have this oversized bearing. This is a regular bearing with a bushing on it, etc., etc., and it leaves a 1/4 inch depth of cut on this. But the bit still spins nicely, and I just put that stop collar back on to hold everything in place. And I'm doing it this way because this is kind of a one-off deal. I'll see if there's a link to a guide bearing that's got a 1/4 inch ID and the appropriate OD to leave a 1/4 inch depth of cut. But the way this is now, this bearing rides on that surface right there, and the cutter cuts that groove. And I want to set the bit just about down to this mark right here. I want to be ever so slightly up for 2 reasons: so that the router bit doesn't burn the surface, which kind of doesn't matter that much, but it also allows the lid to slide more freely at the ends of the box, and that'll probably make sense later. So that's the router bit I use, and I use it in a handheld router because that's kind of what I have on hand these days. So you can see how reconfiguring the router bit by changing the bearing solves one of the problems of making that cutting that slot. But there's another issue that comes up, and it's the size of the router base. When the bearing is in there, if I slide the router all the way over to make a cut, then the bearing or the router can tip down like this, which would be a disaster and spoil the cut and be dangerous and all sorts of stuff. So I need to solve this problem as well. And there's a very simple way of doing it. I suppose I could put a bigger router base on here, but I don't feel like doing that. So I'm just going to take a measurement here. I need about a good inch to support that base and still be able to make a cut on one side. So I just take a scrap of wood like this, mark this should be right at a 1/2 inch, and I can cut an auxiliary strip on the table saw for this. And as long as this strip is at least as long as the box, problem solved. Now I can chuck the bit in the router and carefully set the depth so it just clears the bottom of this surface here. It looks about like that. I hope the camera is focusing. Now with everything set up, I can bring the log back to the bench habit and clamp it firmly in place so that I can route the slot in one side of the block. Here I'm just throwing a couple pieces of masking tape underneath that support block so that it doesn't slide around while I'm routing this slot. And I need to flip this log around so you can watch the process in the camera. I'll be routing this side of the box first for that side of the lid. I double check everything again and then confidently but cautiously cut that little groove in the side of the box. And the process looks very much like that. Nice clean slot, perfectly parallel to this edge, and this edge is perfectly parallel to the one on the opposite side, the center of the block, etc. Now I can flip the block, flip the setup, and route the slot on the other side of this log box. And it's just the nature of this sort of thing that routing the 2 slots in this block is a whole lot easier than it was in the first 2 blocks. But let's see how we did with the fit of the lid in the box. This is a very good thing. The lid is going to fit. It's a little snug, which is just what I want, because I can always trim these off, but I can't trim them on. So I'll do a little adjustment to get this lid to fit like it needs to. Well, I lost some audio there, so I don't know what I missed. I had to change the battery in the little sending unit and forgot to turn that back on. So I don't know what I missed for audio, but what you were watching was me doing the various fitting for this with a putty knife, a laminate file, ultimately a sanding block, until I've got the fit that you see here. It's a little snug somewhere in there. It must be a thick spot in this runner. But ultimately, I'll have other sanding and fitting to do as the process goes on. Not the least because just a couple hours ago, this was a round log and I've cut and exposed these edges. Even though it's very dry, there's still going to be wood movement in this log, and it tends to pinch on the lid. So even by morning, this might be pinched up enough where this lid won't fit through here anymore. That's just the nature of working with this sort of wood. But for the most part, what you've seen is the process for dadoing the recess, routing these slots, and fitting the lid so that it all works here. And this actually should work either way, shouldn't it? Yes, it does. But this knot belongs at that end of the block. For now, for all intents and purposes. And so now you can see a look of the final configuration of the box. Here's where the lid, this is what I was concerned with. I didn't want this part of the lid to be down inside the block, but I do like the way that this lid fits in this box. It wouldn't hurt my feelings if this was a little higher, as if I had made the lid thicker back when those cuts were made that determined everything. But for the most part, I am totally pleased with the way this little gem is coming out. And I'm pleased to the extent that I'm going to go ahead and take the next formative steps for this box, which in this case is to put a nice sweeping curve on each end. Depending on the box design, this could go back to the miter saw and just cut a nice square end on there. That would be just somebody's preference, but because the box has these nice curved sides, I want to put a curved end on there. And I'm going to do this part on the bandsaw, but for anyone lacking a bandsaw, this could be done with a belt sander or give it to a very artistic beaver who could chew that end to a nice shape. This part of the project is another one of those where it's equal parts art and science. So to aid in this, I'm just going to lay a piece of 2-inch green frog tape down there. I think all frog tape is green, but I'm just going to draw a little arc on here like this. And take that and just lay it on here. Yeah, something like that. Just kind of as a rough guide for the bandsaw. Do that twice. I guess if it's frog tape, it should look like a frog, right? And you might find it interesting that I have never used this particular layout method before, but I hope I remember it for next time, because that was pretty quick and pretty slick, if I do say. Cutting pleasing arcs on each end of this log box is a relative breeze on the oversized Laguna bandsaw, even though the blade is kind of dull. And I think that is going to do nicely. And I suppose somebody's going to tell me that looks more like a Ninja Turtle than a Ninja Frog, but what do I know? Nevertheless, that accomplished the purpose of trimming the box ends nice and round. And doing it at this stage makes everything line up nice and perfect so that I can kind of true up these ends with a belt sander next. After roughing out the curved profile on the ends of the box on the bandsaw, I use a 36 grit belt on a belt sander to fair the curve and remove the bandsaw blade marks from the end grain of the box. Notice I've got the lid clamped in place because I want the ends of the lid perfectly flush with the ends of the box when this is finished. After hitting both ends with the 36 grit to remove the bandsaw scratches and to define and smooth the curve, I switched to a 120 grit belt to remove those rough sanding scratches and finalize the smoothness of the curve. And I'm liking the results I get with just a few minutes effort with that belt sander. Even though I am very pleased with the way the box is coming out, the look and the proportion and everything, I really like it. But I think because of the height of the box, it looks a little clunky. So I'm going to embellish the ends to make it look a little more sculpted or refined over here. And that's a pretty simple process at this stage. I just remove the lid and clamp the box in the vise. Did I say vise? I meant bench habit. I'm just going to scribe a line along here about a skinny inch off the bottom. I guess I'll do this on both sides. Something like that, and then go for about 1/4 of an inch in like this. Both of those should work. All right, now I'll clamp it in there. And I'll just break out the belt sander with that 36 grit belt and connect the lines to form a nice, pleasing little bevel on the end of the bottom of the box. I think that shape looks good, so I'll clean it up a little bit with that 120 grit belt and call it good. And I'll be able to true that up, clean it up and round it off a little bit on future sanding steps with finer sandpaper. But that's the idea for changing the look of the end of the box. Now that both ends of the box have that little bevel angle embellishment to them, what do you think? I don't know if you're pleased with the box, but I sure am. And I think it's kind of fun to see the transformation from a log into a functional box. So before I go on to the next step, I'll pause for a word from my sponsors, which I really can't do because I don't have any sponsors. But you can help support the channel and video production here by checking out links in the video description. There's links there to Spring for t-shirts and swag from around the shop. There's links to an Amazon page there for some of the unique tools and supplies I use for making things like these boxes and other stuff in the shop if you can't find those things locally. Any purchases made through those links pay a small ad fee to the channel, which helps video production efforts, and I don't think Jeff Bezos misses that revenue a single bit. I'll also mention that support from patrons to Next Level Carpentry really help in production with videos like this. Just helps offset the income I'm not making doing my day job, and I really appreciate the support of patrons. So if you're interested in supporting the channel that way and sign up as a patron, I want you to know that there's also a library of videos on Patreon, patron-only videos that show in-depth behind-the-scenes content from the shop and from various projects here and out on job sites from my day job. So if you're interested in that, there's a link in the video description for that as well. And I would be remiss without mentioning my good friends at Starbond, who don't sponsor the video, but do provide Starbond products that you see me here using all the time, just like I did fixing that little chip. And Next Level Carpentry viewers can use an exclusive Next Level Carpentry discount code at checkout. Just type in NLC in the coupon code box, get 15% off anything and everything in your order from the website at starbond.com. That's a wonderful thing. And now I'm going to get back to work with the next step. And there's a little bit of a bifurcation in the box making process at this point, and I'll explain. And what I mean is, I keep referring to this as a box with a sliding lid, but really all it is a log with a removable piece. To make it a box, I'll hollow this out. And if you just want a plain functional box, you can skip this next part and go to the part where I hollow this out. But if you want to make an extra special box with a latch that keeps the lid from opening, stick with me and I'll show you how that little process works. And I'm bringing that up at this point because the size of the box is restricted somewhat by the installation of the latch, and you'll see what I mean in the next few steps. Since this is a natural looking box, I don't want any exposed hardware on there, but I do want an effective latch to keep the lid from sliding. So to make a functional latch that's concealed, I'm just going to use a simple clevis pin. This is a 5/16 diameter shaft, or maybe it's 3/8, 5/16 I think, with a button head on one end, and when the latch functions, it'll slip up into the underside of the lid and lock it in place when the lid and the box are flush on one end. I verified that the shank on this pin is indeed 5/16 of an inch, but to start the installation process, I need to drill up a pilot hole or a guide hole all the way through from the bottom of the box into the lid. And I need to make sure that that guide hole is far enough in so that the head of this little pin doesn't stick out of the box. So let's go about this far in. That'll work just fine. And I'll roughly center it in the box. This really doesn't matter, but somewhere about there is about center. The box is irregular and the center is irregular too. I should mention that I decided or determined that I want the latch or the pin on this end of the box. You'll see why later. But for now, I'll use that little mark there as a guide. And because I need to drill from the bottom of the box up, and this isn't sitting very true, I'll just use a couple parallel blocks like this to hold the box in an orientation where the bottom is parallel to the table. The next step is to take the whole business over to the drill press, where I've got a 1/4 inch brad point bit chucked into the drill press so that I can drill a hole as long as the drill bit is down through the bottom of the box and down into the bottom of the lid. And I want to make sure that I get good depth into the lid, but not so much that the drill bit comes out the top. That would be a fail at this point. And now, with everything set up, I'll drill that hole full depth for the length of this drill bit. And the hole will serve as a guide for the function and installation of this cool secret hidden latch, and convert this from a regular box to a pretty cool puzzle box. And drilling with a firm but non-aggressive pecking action like this also helps keep the drill bit from wandering in the dense grain of this hard wood. So the end result is a nice, clean, straight hole. And I'll make a special mention that it's important to have the lid and the end of the box flush while drilling that hole, so that when the pin's engaged, the lid's closed nicely and not offset one way or the other. The next step for creating this puzzle box latch for the sliding top is to chase the 1/4 inch hole with a regular 5/16 diameter twist drill bit. And drilling the holes in this sequence, make sure that they're concentric, which is very important for the function of the hidden latch. Besides drilling concentric holes, the next most important thing is to set the depth of this 5/16 bit so it goes about 3/8 of an inch into the bottom face of the lid. And this 3/8 of an inch dimension determines how far the pin slides up into the lid to hold it in place. Going less than about 3/8 limits the strength of the pin for holding the lid, and going more just makes it more difficult for the puzzle box latch to operate. But drilling this hole using the drill press and the parallel blocks is a quick and easy process. And you can see with the hole drilled how the pin slides into the bottom of the box and also fits into the hole in the bottom of the lid. And because of the sequence I used, I know that those holes line up perfectly. The next step is to enlarge the hole in the bottom of the box for clearance of the button top on this pin. And to determine the depth of the hole, I slip the pin into the lid and mark it with a Sharpie, and then transfer that mark to the outside of the lid. So that's how deep the pin can go into the lid. Now I slide the lid shut, hold the pin to the mark, and put a mark on the box where the button head of the pin will be when the pin is dropped to its maximum depth in the lid. I use a precision guessometer to measure the diameter of the button head on the pin, which is just under 7/16. So I select a drill bit that's just over 7/16 at 29/64 to use for counterboring the hole in the bottom of the box. Then I use the drill press's depth stop to set the bottom of this hole at the pencil line for the button head on the top of the pin. And I set that depth a little bit shallow for now because I can always deepen it if necessary for adjustment of the puzzle box latch later. I use a high speed on this big drill bit so that it doesn't grab the work and make the hole too deep or spoil the box. And now, if I've done everything right, I can drop the pin into the hole in the bottom of the box and have it come out to extend into the underside of the lid. But as you can see, it's kind of a press fit, which isn't going to work for the latch. So I'm going to ream this hole out to 1/64 of an inch over 5/16, or 21/64 for a drop-in fit of the pin through the holes in the box and the lid. And I just need to resize the hole from here to here so I can set the block up in this orientation and get that done. Now the pin's an easy fit there and quickly drops through the box there and extends up enough to fit into the hole on the underside of the lid once I ream this out a little bit with that same bit. Because as you can see, the pin doesn't drop into the lid any easier than it dropped through that 5/16 hole in the box. So I realign the end of the lid with the end of the box and adjust the depth of the drill bit to the same line on the end of the lid and chase the hole out with this bigger bit. And now the pin should slide down through the hole and into the lid like that and prevent the lid from opening until the pin drops out and the lid slides again. So it's great to have that part of the hidden box latch mechanism taken care of with these holes. And I do want to remind viewers that I warned you this is a rough cut video, so if some of the editing is choppy or out of sequence, bear with me. But as it is, the pin is in there doing its job, keeping the lid from sliding. And when I turn the box over, assuming that the lid is perfectly lined up, the pin drops out of the hole. And the reason I chose to do all that in this sequence is to make sure that I leave enough room in the end of the box for the pinhole and the shoulder of the pin as I hollow out this box, which is the next step. So the pin's a little bigger than the hole, like that. So the end of the box needs to account for that. So I'm going to go right about here with the end of the box, and then the rest of the end of the box, let's make it about a 1/2 inch thick, here and here, and here, all the way across. And then I can just do a little bit of a fancy flare here to make the transition for that part of the box, because that needs to stay in there for the latch. And then all this can get cut out just like that. And now to transform this from a log with a piece of sliding bark on it into a box with a sliding lid, I need to hollow this whole thing out. And here again, there's any number of ways of doing that, but I'm going to approach it practically with what I have on hand. And I'm going to start with a couple Forstner bits to drill some stuff out here and just remove the bulk of the material before resorting to other methods to hollow it out. I want to leave about, half an inch of thickness at the bottom of the box. So I'll use that line there to set the depth of the drill bits. And I'll remove the bulk of the material with a large bit. This is 2 1/16 as it turns out. But I want to first do the corners, and I've got a 1 inch Forstner bit that I'll start off with in the corners. Once again, my weapon of choice for this is the drill press, where I've chucked that 1 inch Forstner bit in place and set the depth to the line for the bottom of the box. And that should do it. Now I'll just use these pencil marks as a guide to drill holes for the 2 corners here, the 2 transitions here, and 2 corners on this end. And I'm going to make the bit tangent to this shoulder and to that line. Well, that's not a good sign. Well, I'll leave that in the video just to prove it can happen to the best of us, or even me. And luckily, in this case, no fault, no foul. After rechecking the bit, I finish drilling the holes and then go back and recheck to make sure they're all the same depth, which luckily they are. And that step makes quick work of making nice, clean, round corners for the inside of the box. Now that the corners are cleaned out, I put for that large Forstner bit, like I said, this is 2 1/16 of an inch, and I add a block and some clamps to minimize the risk of the bit catching the block and pulling it loose from my grip. I also slow the bit speed dramatically to 250 RPM as recommended for boring these holes in a controlled fashion. And with everything set up, I just make successive holes, clearing out the bulk of the material inside of the box using the same depth setting for this big bit as I did the little ones, so that the bottom of the box comes out relatively flat. For each successive hole, I drop the bit down where the next hole needs to be drilled and then adjust the safety fence and reclamp it while the bit's locked it down in that position. Then I release the quill with the quill clamp and proceed to drill the hole. I continue clearing out the bulk of the material from the inside of the box with overlapping holes with this giant bit. Overlapping just enough to make the holes stay true, but not so much that it leaves a bunch of extra material in between successive holes. It's a bit ironic, but when drilling holes this large, even at a slow speed, the biggest risk in my mind comes when I'm lifting the bit out of the hole, because if things get misaligned, it can grab the workpiece and spin it when it's raised above the safety fence. So keep that in mind if you're doing a project like this. And I'm setting it so the tangent point of the bit is just inside this rail, because I want the side of the box to be straight later. I don't want to nick the rail, and I want to leave a little material to trim off in the next step. And I decided to add another clamp to this setup for drilling a few of these holes to both increase safety and increase efficiency of getting the job done. And you can see, depending on the overlap of the holes and the size of the bit, you can end up with artifacts in here, which are good to have because it gives the bit support all the way around, but also means there's another factor where those blocks could get caught up and cause the block to twist or split. And if you don't know what I'm talking about a quill lock, it's this little lever up here. Tightening the lever pinches this and holds the quill in place. You can see where it just retracts up on its own there. But when I bring this down to the position I'm interested in, which is going to be right about there, I can lock this in place, and then the quill stays where it is as I make other adjustments. Once I'm satisfied with the setup and all the adjustments, I just release the quill lock to retract the quill and then pull it down in the same location to drill that hole. And it looks like I've got room for one more hole here. And I'll try to center the hole up in between these various lugs to keep it clean. And this is what each of those holes looks like when it's partially drilled. Kind of cool how it guides itself by the rim and not the center point, so these types of holes are possible. And you heard the drill bit beating on that little lug there, which is what I was talking about, drilling these partial holes. You just kind of got to watch it. Looks like I got a little more depth I need there. Like that. And you can also see I got a bit of an issue. These holes in the back here, you can see in that, these holes are too deep. As that drill bit was slipping out of place, it over drilled the holes on this end, which is not making me a happy camper, but it's a reality and I'll have to deal with it. And it's kind of amazing when you see the volume of chips that came out of this little box, but it's also pretty cool because this is a quick and easy way for removing all that material. And with that chore out of the way, I'm ready to do some cleanup on the inside of the box. I'll make a couple comments here. It's a bit ironic. This is probably the last project you'll see me using this drill press for. This is going to get an upgrade here next week. I'm not sure when I'll actually break in the new replacement for this, but I thought I'd say that I've got a choice of which machines I have in the shop, and a drill press is invaluable to me. I'd rather have it than a disc sander or a belt sander, stationary machines, just because it's more functional and I can handle the sanding operations other ways. If I had a giant shop, yes, I'd love to have a number of different machines, including a couple power sanders, machine sanders, and a lathe. But as it is, I put a drill press right up there on the level of importance as a miter saw and a table saw, and not just because of projects like this. And now I am happy to report that this log has turned into a box, and the box has a lid that fits and a latch that works, partially. Observant viewers may have noticed that a crack developed in this end of the log. Not so much in that end, there's a little bit of one there, but that crack developed when the material in the middle that was holding it together was removed. But I want to get that taken care of, so I'm going to kind of clamp it in position, take it over to the bench habit, and guess what? Break out some Starbond glue. To focus clamping pressure where it does the most good, I'm just going to add a little block here, some clamping pressure on there to kind of tighten up that crack a little bit, which would be its natural state. And I'll say that it would be a mistake to assume that I use Starbond glue because they sponsor videos, because they don't sponsor videos, but I do promote their products, and it's not because of the relationship with Starbond, but because the glue just works. On a crack like this, I want to put a liberal application of spray accelerator there just to get things moving, and then I'll use the medium viscosity for its wicking properties down into a crack this size. If the crack was thinner, I would use the thin CA because it has more capillary action, but if I used the super thin in this crack, it would just run through out the other side, not do anybody any good. So I just add a couple layers, spritzing it with accelerator in between, and what that does is pull accelerant down into the crack as the CA cures, and that's a little bit different than just spraying it once and then waiting for that CA to set up. Not sure what the reflection is like in the camera, but I just use reflection across the end of this crack as it cures to make sure it's full. And I can just add successive coats just like that until I'm happy. Add a little more CA accelerant there. And this is kind of hard to see. In fact, it's really hard to see. But I'm going to do the same thing on the inside, except because I know the crack is sealed up on the outside and this glue won't run out, I'm going to use the thin on the inside to really get those pores in the wood sealed together nicely. I'm not worried about the extra on the inside because that'll all get trimmed out when I'm shaping the inside of the box. So that's plenty of glue and it's going to do a great job. But because of the nature of the stress on this particular crack, it's trying to pull apart versus just hold things together. So I'm going to let this set up longer, like a half an hour, or in this case, overnight. I'm done for the day, to make sure that that CA is stuck 100%, because this is a little bit of an unusual application for it, because like I said, the stress on that crack. But once this is thoroughly set up, I can unclamp it and scrape the joint clean a little bit before proceeding with the next steps. And come to think of it, while I'm at it, I'm going to get the repair process started on the other end of the box as well. And I'll make sure to tuck all my little Starbond CA glue friends away in their little caddy for a good night's rest. Not that it needed it necessarily, but I let this Starbond medium CA glue set up overnight. So when I release the clamp pressure, there's no stress on that seam. And I'll just use a file to clean the hardened CA glue off of here. And I didn't use a colored CA glue for this because when I put the finish on that, I want that to kind of go away versus sometimes I'll use a black or a dark brown CA to highlight the crack. But that is fixed, as is the small crack on the other end. And after making sure the top surface is clean by going over it with a file, I can slip the lid back in place to make sure everything still jives up, which it does nicely. So I'm pleased that the box didn't expand or contract in the process and make the lid fit loose or require more shaving for a good fit. But now it's time to clean out the cavity for the inside of the box. No doubt there's any number of ways of cleaning up the recess in this box, but I'm going to use a router to do it. So I've clamped the box in the bench habit here with a couple supporting blocks to hold it firmly at a good working height. And I'm going to use a series of router bits and a series of steps to get this done. So I'm starting out with a 1/4 inch shank, 5/8 diameter, 5/8 inch cut length flush trim pattern bit. And what this will do, this bearing will ride on this surface here on the two sides to true up the inside of the box to the top. But on these ends, I'm just going to have to freehand into that pencil mark. Like before, I need to keep the router from tilting in the process. So I'll use the same filler block for that purpose. And I'll retrace these lines a little bit so I can see them. That should work. So I'm just going to true up this side here first, and then do a little freehand work on the ends. But it's going to be a little bit tricky to see with this camera angle and me hanging onto the router in a manner that gets the job done, but doesn't block the camera's view. And you can see what this step is doing. It's just transferring this straight edge down below here so I can lower it, and I have another surface down here to guide the bearing on a larger bit in the next set of steps. I approach this with caution when there's big lugs of wood sticking out here because I don't want the router to catch and jump, but with a nice steady feed rate, this is not that difficult to do. I tape that little filler block in place so that I can freehand this end up to that pencil mark and not worry about that block moving around. Notice while I'm freehanding the ends of the box, I'm using the router in climb cutting mode, so if the bit catches and takes off, it takes off out of the piece instead of into it, like it would do if I was pushing the router, which is the normal function for these bits. Also notice that I'm very particular about the shape of the inside of the lip on the ends of this box, because the shape of the end of the box on this first pass determines the shape of the end of the box all the way down to the bottom. And I want it to be as nice, smooth, and even as possible. And I think this will do nicely. To finish hollowing out the cavity for this box, I'm going to switch to a nice brand new Whiteside number 3018 top bearing flush trim pattern bit, because the one I've had for years is a little dull and I don't want it to have to work any harder than necessary to clean this out nice and smooth. And I got to say that that is one impressive router bit right there. With all this mass and these sharp edges, you got to be careful, because if something goes wrong, it goes wrong in a big way, in a big hurry. But I do like the bit, and even though Whiteside doesn't sponsor any videos here, I really do like their router bits. Even though it's a bit amusing how you see some tool companies throwing their tools at some YouTube channels while basically ignoring others. But truth be told, most of that sponsorship stuff is just more trouble than it's worth anyways. And I'd just as soon go out and buy the bit and use it instead of jumping through all the hoops necessary to acquire sponsorships for tools and products. To make the next pass for cleaning out this box cavity, I've lowered this bit so that the bearing rides on the edge I just created with that smaller bearing all the way around. But I'm not setting it all the way down to maximum depth so that I can control the cut and get a nice smooth job of this next pass. I'm going to tap out a couple of these chunks in the bottom, just because there's no sense in letting those things rattle around in there when they get hit by the router bit. And everything else should trim off pretty smoothly, as long as I use this filler piece to keep the router from tipping. As with any operation, using a bit this large, making this big of a cut, I approach with plenty of RPM and a slow feed rate to keep the cut smooth and minimize the chance of getting big chunky chips out of the wood. And there you can see the nice smooth result that I'm getting using this bit and this sequence. So I'll finish trimming up this side of the box before moving the spacer over and trimming the other side. And I'll emphasize that it's very important the router bit catches this bearing surface here. If the bit was set too high, it would tear through the end of this block in an instant and spoil the whole project. And I dare say, that's looking pretty sweet. To do the final pass that cleans up the bottom of the box, I'm really pushing this setup to the max. This is a good stout 1/2-inch shank router bit, but I've extended it out of the chuck more than I normally would, and it's now low enough to clean up the bottom of the box. You can see the router rocking here because the bit is sitting on the bottom. And if I didn't already say it, I'm pushing this whole setup to the max. This is a giant bit. It's spinning at high RPM. It's extended out of the chuck. I'm using it handheld, etc., etc. So I've got to really pay attention to this. And this is a time when it wouldn't be a bad idea to just use one of those little handheld carbide carving burrs to smooth this up. So if you get to this stage of a project and you're nervous, just do something that you're comfortable with, because everything has to go right and things could get out of hand in a hurry. But I'm plenty comfortable doing this. As you've noticed, each time I need to take the router out, I let the bit come to a complete stop. And in this case, I've got to make sure the bit is spinning at full speed before I tip it the final way down into the box, because that bit actually has to drill down into the bottom of the box initially to get this process started. But this is what it looks like. And that's what I want this to look like. Everything's wonderful except for these corners where that bit dropped down and dug a little too deep. And I may just set this router bit a little bit deeper, but I don't want the bottom of the box to be too thin. So I might end up just filling those in. But that's what that looks like after the pass. Now I just need to clean up the bottom on this side. And here again, second verse, the same as the first. And just for future reference, I'm using this bit at 2 5/8 projection here, and it's doing a fine job with the setup and circumstances I've got going here. I'll make a point here that the inside corner of this box cutout is getting awful close to the outside corner over here. And if there was a little more curvature to the box at this point, that router bit had come right out the side, which is something I really didn't anticipate or think through. So I'm thankful I didn't have a problem with this box, but that kind of lends itself to the decision of where the bottom of the box, that initial cut, is made. The farther up I go, the less the sides of the box curve in. And another way to prevent that happening where the bit comes out the side of the box is to make this part thicker. So those are some of the factors involved in working with irregular material like this. But I think so far so good, and I'm quite pleased. I'll take a minute and talk through a design pivot point that I'm at right now. And if you remember, the bit slipped out of the chuck and 4 of these little holes got over drilled, which is a problem. I'm thankful that they didn't spoil the box completely when that happened, but it's a reality that I've got to deal with. And right now, if I set this little depth gauge to the bottom of a hole like that, I'd have to remove this much material from the whole bottom of the box to make it completely flat, remove those little circles, and remove these little pilot points from the big Forstner bit. But I just don't want to do that. I want to keep the box bottom at this thickness. So what I'm going to do is make an inlay or an infill for this. I think I'll take a piece of thin material and put flocking or velvet on the bottom. It'll be a nice look for the bottom of the box, and it'll get around having to make the whole bottom of the box so thin, and where that wouldn't always be a bad idea. In this case, I've got to do a little more work for the bottom of this pin, and if the bottom's too thin, that's not going to work. So there's my decision. The box is staying like this. I'm a little frustrated that those divots are in there. If I wanted to preserve the bottom of the box, I could make some infills for those, but like I said, I think I'll just make a laminate layer for the whole bottom of the box and handle it that way. As it is, the box is in mighty fine shape with the cavity all hollowed out, the lid still fitting nicely in place. Everything's good. So I am going to proceed with the final steps for the latch. I need to do two more things to make this puzzle box latch work properly. And the first is to keep the pin from falling out of the bottom of the box when it's not engaged. And to do that, I choose to use a piece of brass strip to plug the hole. This piece is a little over 1/16 of an inch thick, and it's exactly a 1/2 inch wide, and I want it to cover up that hole. So I draw a couple of guidelines to work from, and then go back to the drill press and drill a couple of shallow holes with a 1/2 inch Forstner bit, with one hole concentric to the 7/16 hole I drilled earlier, and the other lined up between the pencil marks, so that the total length of the resulting oblong hole is about 1 inch. I drilled the 2 holes deep enough so that the brass strip is recessed into the bottom of the box, but not any deeper than necessary. Just as simple as that. Then I use a sharp chisel to connect the 2 holes so that I have one oblong recess in the bottom of the box. Then I mark the brass strip to length, cut it with a hacksaw, and file it until the little piece of brass fits down into the recessed hole in the bottom of the box. After a few minutes, fussing, filing, and fitting, the small brass tab drops nicely down into that hole where it's recessed from the bottom of the box. A quick touch with a fine sandflex block puts a real shine on that little brass tab in nothing flat, and removes tarnish from the screw head just as fast. So I can finish up by dropping the pin into the hole, covering the hole with the brass tab, drilling a little pilot hole, and securing the tab in place with a shiny brass screw. And now that small brass tab holds the pin in place when it's not engaged in the lid. And this sequence here is why I didn't really want to make the bottom of the box thinner, because that little tab is right under here, and I didn't want the screw or the little recess to compromise the strength of the bottom at that location. And now that you know most of the secret of this hidden puzzle box latch from seeing how the holes are drilled and located, there's one more little step that you need to know, and that is that the pin doesn't hold itself up into the lid very well on its own. When the box is moved around, the pin just drops down. So the last step in making this latch functional is to put a small magnet up in that 1/4 inch hole that we started out drilling into the lid, where the magnet can hold the pin in place and keep the box secret and secure. After a fair bit of Edisonian type experimentation for making this latch hidden and functional, I settled on 1/4 inch diameter spherical neodymium magnets, like the ones here. These are fantastic little magnets, and I'll give a shout out to my buddy Jason at Total Element Magnets, totalelement.com online. And Jason provided me with these magnets for a project a while back that never materialized, but I have the magnets here for this, and I can tell you that Total Element stocks a wide selection of amazing magnets, and that combined with all the knowledge that he and his staff have, they can fix you up with any magnet you need for any project, big or small. So check them out. Shout out to Jason at Total Element. But that's where I got this 1/4 inch neodymium magnet, and it's plenty strong to hold that little pin up into the lid, with a little bit of a caveat. And I always love it when a solution or product is actually too good and you have to dial it back. And that's the case here, because it's possible to put this in such a manner that that pin doesn't want to release when you go to open the box. So it's critical to set that magnet at the correct depth in the bottom of the lid. So if I drop the pin into the hole in the bottom of the box and then measure the depth of the 1/4 inch hole in the bottom of the hole that's just a little bigger than 5/16, that's the maximum depth that I can set that little ball magnet. And I just want to make sure that it's more than enough. If you can see this, the space between the pin and this depth gauge is more than 1/4 inch, which is the diameter of that little ball. So I'm just going to drop this little round magnet into the hole in the bottom of the box and use a fiberglass rod to tap it into place. And now if I set the depth gauge to the height of the pin, like that, I just need to make sure that that magnet is set deep enough. And as you can see, it's jumping out of the hole. So I'm going to press it in a little more firmly, and it keeps popping out. So it looks like I'm going to need to add a little bit of Starbond CA glue to hold the magnet down there where it needs to be. Or better yet, I'll set the depth on this. Yeah, let's do it this way. So that magnet's actually a little too deep as it sits. But I'm going to stick it in place there and then make an adjustment by making the counterbore hole in here a little deeper so that the pin can protrude a little farther. It shouldn't take much CA glue to hold that ball bearing down in that spot. So now that I make sure it's deep enough, I'm just going to spray a little accelerator in there. Then take a few drops of thin CA to hold it in place. This is an old bottle with an old tip, so it wants to plug up a little bit. There you saw I got about 2 or 3 drops down in there, which should be plenty to hold it in place. And now that that's set up, it still comes out. So I'm going to switch to medium CA for a little more holding power. You can't see it in there, but I can. So let's go with that. You might be able to see the ball bearing down in there. We know how deep it is because of this. And now it's stuck. And it's stuck at this depth. So that this pin looks like it needs another 1/16 of an inch to touch the magnet. But we'll do an experiment first and see if the magnet is strong enough to hold the pin just like it is. And to make sure this end is perfectly flush, that's the importance of that. And so that's not enough. I got to make that hole a little bit deeper. Except the lid wasn't lined up, so let's do this again. So the magnet wants to hold it, but it doesn't hold it very strongly. So I'll make that counterbore hole just a little deeper. I've got to go a little bit deeper yet with this 7/16 bit. It's getting really close, so I'll give it another try. So the pin is keeping the lid from opening. It takes a little bit of force to drop the pin. So I'm going to go with that setting for now, because it seems to be quite nice. Not too easy, not too difficult. So we'll just reinstall all this so that the pin is contained in the box, falls freely into position, and works to secure the lid just like it's supposed to. And I guess that segment is a prime example of how Next Level Carpentry videos end up so long. My goodness, what was that, 15 minutes or more to install that latch, but near as I can tell, that's a latch unique to anything on YouTube, as is having it applied or installed in a box like this. And I want to show you all those steps because those are the ones I went through in getting the latch figured out. It was a surprise in the beginning. I didn't intend on using a pin that was as hefty for this. I just had a piece of 1/8 inch, like a 16 penny framing nail with the end cut off and a head on it to stick to that magnet. But Jason's magnets are so good that there wasn't enough inertia or mass in the pin, so I had to slam the box really hard to get it to release. because there just wasn't enough action. And even with this pin, you can hear me, I'm tapping this pretty hard. I like to tell people put the box at about a 45-degree angle and drop it. But this is sticking in there now, even at that. So if that persists, I may have to shorten the pin. I may have to put a little plastic tab on the end or something to get it to release without destroying the box. But all those are factors in creating something like this, and I like to include them in the video, so that's why I set this part aside as a special chapter in this lengthy video. But once I get that latch to release, I'll take the box apart, sand it, and come back to the video when I'm ready to apply a coat of Old Master's gel poly to the box, which is the finish that this will get. This could be serious. Hopefully this comes across as the nature of a rough cut video. What I discovered is that there's a position in this pin right there that it just sticks on its own. Must be a little eccentricity in something. So I'm going to just chuck the pin in the drill here. I guess I'm not going to do it that way. I'm going to have to get a drill bit and ream that out a little bit so that the pin doesn't stick like that. I can't feel any irregularity on the pin, but it's a deal. So I've got the pin that's 5/16 plus a 1/64 of an inch. Here I've got the 7/16 inch bit again, and I'm going to run it backwards in there. What appears to be happening is that the shoulder of the button head on that pin is sticking in the countersunk bottom of that hole, because the hole is V-shaped and the pin is square. So at full depth, it's actually sticking on the wood. So I'm going to have to make the hole a little bit deeper so that the pin sticks to the magnet and not to the wood in here. That way the pin won't be able to go up far enough to stick. Plus, what I should have done in the first place is put a bit of wax on it. With all this trouble for the future, I'm going to see if I can find a pin with a bigger diameter head. So now the pin is just sticking to the magnet and not sticking in the wood. This keeps the lid latched, doesn't fall out until the box is dropped. Regular handling doesn't disengage the pin, which is where I want it. Just like it needs to be. But then releases on cue, like that. So much for installing a simple latch, right? Anybody that knows anything about Next Level Carpentry knows that Lintz Brothers Pizza Box time is the same thing as Old Master's gel poly time. And as such, I finished sanding the box, tuning it up, dialing in the edges, and sanding this to 320 grit, which is a nice prep for the Old Master's gel poly. I'll show you one more thing here, and that I just filled in those holes in the bottom of the box. The drill holes that got too deep, plus the pilot holes from the Forstner bit. I just filled that in with Bondo because I decided I'm going to put a flocked finish in the bottom of that, a spray-on flocking finish. And all I need for that is for it to be smooth or flat. So with no further ado, I am going to lay on a coat of Old Masters gel poly. The difference on this project is that I'm going to attempt to keep the gel poly off the natural finish. I'll just dial it in around the edges because I don't want to darken that natural patina finish there. It would look pretty cool if it was darkened up, but I don't want it to be shiny at all. So it is time for this. Nothing earth-shattering here. Everybody's seen me use this stuff. Well, a lot of you guys have seen me use this stuff before, but I just can't resist showing what that looks like when it first goes on. Just gotta love that. I'm not too concerned about getting it down in that hole because I can just blow it out with compressed air while it's still wet. You can see here that where I repaired that end with CA glue just kind of blends in once the poly goes on there because it evens out the darkness of that area. You can see a little bit of the darkness here on that along the glue line where the glue soaked in, but as soon as the poly goes on there, it just kind of darkens the whole works. You can still see the crack, but not the lipstick smudge left by the CA glue that soaks into that. Use a couple of bevel sticks here to hold the box up while I apply gel poly to the rest of this. I'll do the bottom of the box, even though that just gets covered later with the flocking, but this will seal it up good and help that flocking process go better. I spent a little bit of time sanding the inside of the box, but between you and me and a couple other people that are still watching the video at this point, the box on the inside of the box isn't buffed up with sandpaper near like the outside and the other surfaces. Of course, the goal at this point is just to get gel poly everywhere, get it soaking in. I can use an acid brush to get inside those tracks to make sure that that's got a good coating. This is such a nice smooth finish. It'll help that lid glide nicely. Won't make it sticky at all once it's secured. Can use that for some of these corners too, get that all slathered up good. Nice thing about the poly is it doesn't run, pretty much stays where you put it, so I can go right up to these natural edges here and not worry about spoiling them. There'll be a little bit of finish migration into those areas, but as long as it's right along the edges, it's going to be fine. I'm going extra heavy on this end grain here. I really want that to seal up nice. It's where it soaks in the most. After several minutes of coating, recoating, soaking, and more soaking, it's time to give this gel poly a buff. The nature of this end grain means that if I want a really excellent finish on this, I'll have to let this dry for 24 hours, scuff it with 320 grit sandpaper, and recoat it. The more times you do that, the more luster the finish gets, but also the more time it takes. So there's a trade-off that I'm not sure how I'm going to deal with this time, but for now, I'm going to get this first coat buffed off, show off the beauty of this ash box. A well-timed blast with compressed air over the whole piece forces any of the gel poly that's worked its way down into knots and cracks and latch holes, etc., so that I can buff it off with the rest of the finish so that everything dries nice and smooth instead of having gooey globs tucked in corners, cracks, and crevices. But after the blowgun treatment and a final buff with a clean dry paper towel, the first heavy sealing coat of gel poly is applied to all the raw wood surfaces where I can let it dry overnight in the shop. And that completed first coat gives you a pretty good idea of what this Deadwood box is going to look like when it's complete. After letting that gel poly set up overnight, I scuffed it with 320 and gave it a second coat early this morning, 12 hours ago or so. Put it out in the sun, so I got a nice, smooth, just buttery smooth finish on the box. And there's still a few more things that need to happen to complete the box, even though I was just editing video, and this is probably close to 2 hours into the video for making a box. But I want to show you a couple more things if anybody's still out there watching, and I'll bring you in close to see it. And I'm always bragging about the gel poly finish, and the way to really bring it home and make it shine is to use the world's finest sandpaper, just give it a little buff at the end. Just puts the slightest luster on the finish and makes it unbelievably smooth. And you probably can't tell the difference in the camera, but it makes a difference. And this finish is just remarkable, if I do say. And with that, the lid slides in easier than ever because of that smooth finish, which makes the box function just wonderfully. So with that step completed, the first next to the last thing I'm going to do is put some little protective feet on the bottom of the box. And I like these little vinyl pads, 1/2-inch vinyl pads. I get these at Ace Hardware. And we'll stick some of these in the bottom. But there's a next level way to do even this so that those pads stay stuck and look professional when they're in place. And in my opinion, the thing that separates a good job from a great job when it comes to this is using a 1/2-inch Forstner bit to counterbore a couple holes that act as a recess for those feet. And this step actually is just as simple as that. And something as simple as that little recess actually makes a difference on how well the feet stick on, because it's nice, clean, fresh wood, and also helps them from flipping off when the box is slid around on a surface. Those little feet finish up the outside of the box, but that leaves the inside of the box needing a little attention before I'm going to call it complete. You can see here what I alluded to earlier. I changed my mind on treatment for the bottom of the box, and probably isn't showing the camera too well, but I just use auto body filler, Bondo, to fill in those recesses and the little dimples made from the Forstner bits. And I did that before I put the gel poly on, but this doesn't look very good. So rather than make an insert with flocking on it, I'm actually going to apply a Donger Suede Tex coat to the bottom of the box. And that requires two things, an adhesive and the flocking itself. And I chose to go with this dark brown as an accent color for the box. I don't think you're going to believe this, but the Donger flocking process actually works better when applied over a Lintz Brothers pizza box as well. And it's a very simple process. There's two parts to it. This is the undercoat. It's brown. I just want to make sure this thick stuff is all stirred up nice for consistency. I've had this stuff for 21 years. It's still in good shape, if you could believe that. That'll be just fine. And this is thick enamel, and I'm just going to apply it with a brush to the bottom of the box. Keep in mind that anywhere this undercoat goes, the flocking sticks. I don't really want this puddled anywhere, but I do want a thick, even coat. Because it's enamel, it dries very slow. It's thick and sticky. And I'm just cutting into that edge in the corner there. Just kind of brushing it out, try to get it even. And watching me apply this stuff is about as exciting as watching it dry. So I'll finish up applying this coat to the bottom of the box and get back to you. So there, after about 5 minutes, 10 minutes maybe, got a nice thick even coat on the bottom of the box. I took a little cloth and wiped up some of the goober smudges I had on the edges. But the next step in this process is to apply the Suede Tex fibers. Like I said, I'm using the brown. I've got some in this bag, and this is 21 years old as well. And there's a number of ways of applying the fibers. But because I've done a fair amount of this stuff, I've got the aerosol applicator. So I basically just put the fuzz in the can and spray it on with a blowgun. I use my favorite disposable funnel trick for something like this. Now, with a generous quantity of the flocking fibers in the can, I plug it into an air hose and apply a nice heavy coating inside the box on the bottom. And if it goes like it should, it's a pretty quick, simple, and painless process. Very little air pressure is applied. I'm barely pulling the trigger, and it's recommended to put a nice heavy coat in to make sure it's really covering that adhesive with the flocking. And that's about what it looks like with those fibers applied. And the instructions say to let this dry for a good 10 to 15 hours. So I'm going to put a little bit of a heat lamp on it to get the cure started, and then I'll clean this up in the morning when it's dry for sure. And a good dose of artificial sunshine here should really speed up the process and set the undercoat so it firmly grips the fibers, making for a nice, plush, velvety surface on the bottom of the inside of the box. Now that that flocking base coat has had plenty of time to set up, this is almost 24 hours. I had the heat lamp on it and some bright sunshine, so that undercoat is really dry. And now you get to see just how slick the spray-on flocking process is, because all the fibers that are going to stick to the undercoat are stuck. So I can just tip the box upside down and tap it on a sheet of paper to dislodge all the loose fibers that I can now recycle by folding the sheet of paper and pouring them back into the bag of flocking fibers. As you can see, this process doesn't recapture 100% of the extra fibers, but it captures enough to make it worth the effort of collecting and recycling them. Once the majority of the loose fibers are removed by shaking and tapping, I use compressed air to blow away the rest of the fibers that are clinging onto the box with static electricity. And some of those fibers are really clinging, so I'll dislodge those with a soft brush and a little more compressed air to finish the cleanup process. And by highlighting the fibers with the beam of a flashlight, you can see what a nice finish this is for the bottom of the box, especially considering how simple it is to apply Donger spray-on flocking. With the flocking complete, I hesitate to make this long video longer than it already is, but I've still been having a little bit of a challenge making this latch work like it should, because when the pin is fully extended, it sticks in place. And I reamed the hole out, I tried wax on the pin and everything else, but it still does that. And if it can stick like that, it can stick when the box is closed and potentially never be able to get it open. And upon investigating to what on earth that problem could be, I first decided to switch to a Forstner bit for reaming this hole, thinking that the problem was the hole was tapered on the bottom and the shoulder of the pins are flat. I thought the pin was digging in. But by looking down in that hole with a flashlight, I can see that the two holes are not concentric, so that the pin is forced over to one side because of the button head. And you might even be able to see what I'm talking about when I shine a bore light down into the counterbore hole, and you can see that the counterbore shoulder and the hole are eccentric instead of concentric, which is the whole source of the problem of the latch pin sticking. The solution is to take the Forstner bit and ream the hole out just a little bit on the one side so there's an even shoulder, a concentric shoulder around the hole where the pin drops. The adjustment required is very small, and it does take a bit of fussing with that Forstner bit, but if you look close, you can see that now the shoulder and the hole are concentric, and the pin doesn't stick in any position. So now I can finally install the little brass keeper plate for good. And now, when the box is turned upside down and the pin contacts the magnet, it holds the lid securely, and normal shaking and wiggling of the box don't dislodge the pin or allow the box to be opened. So I hope it's clear why I invested this extra time in the length of the video to explain in detail the fine adjustment necessary to make the puzzle box latch work predictably like it's supposed to. There's no bigger buzzkill than to hand somebody a puzzle box that you can't even open yourself because the latch isn't functioning. But as it is, with the pin floating freely when it's necessary, the box doesn't open, shaking doesn't release the pin, only the action of the actual solution for solving the puzzle box, which is to tilt the box at about a 45-degree angle and drop it on a firm surface to disengage the pin and reveal the contents or the inside of the box. And with the pin floating freely, again, it's engaged, and you can hear it catch that small spherical neodymium magnet in the lid. Now that you know what it takes to make a live-edge Deadwood puzzle box from a log and have in-depth knowledge how to create and troubleshoot the latch mechanism, you can stump your friends with frustration as they try to figure out how to open the box you make, and then amaze them as you solve and open the box to reveal its contents. So now, I'll wrap up this epic video by offering congratulations to all 17 viewers who are still here at the bitter end. And to say, as always, and until next time, thanks for watching. And for any of you who are still watching at the end of the end of the end after that epic video, I've got a little treat for you because I want to show you an advanced design with potential for these live edge Deadwood puzzle boxes. You can see here that I've taken the smallest log, the one with the curve in it, and actually fabricated the lid for it. But you can see there's a unique feature here in that the log is curved and so is the lid. I worked out a process for creating this slot in here with a curve and then matching the curve on the lid. And although I haven't refined the fit of this curved lid and the curved log, I think you can see the design potential of this sort of feature in a box like this, because it opens up a wide range of possibilities for logs with unique shape and extraordinary character, which seems appropriate for designing live edge Deadwood puzzle boxes. Although I hope you understand why I didn't include the process I used for creating a box of this design at the end of this epic video, but it does give me hopes and anticipation for possibilities of making a large curved lid log box out of this special piece of unstarted furniture. And anyone that stayed for this segment definitely deserves extra congratulations for getting to the end of the end of the end of that epic video.